The drive up from Manhattan took just under 90 minutes, but it felt longer. I'd left early, before the traffic thickened on the Palisades, and by the time I crossed the Bear Mountain Bridge, the Hudson was a flat sheet of pewter under a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. November in the valley had a way of making everything look and feel like a photograph left too long in the sun. The trees had already shed most of their color, and what remained clung to the branches in thin, rusted patches, as if the season had simply exhausted them. I pulled into Cold Spring a little after 10. The town announced itself quietly. A single main street, lined with brick and clapboard storefronts, ran parallel to the river. A coffee shop, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a florist whose window display hadn't been changed since September. The kind of place where people still put their last names on their mailboxes and meant something by it. I'd been to a dozen towns like this in the past 5 years, and they all blurred together after a while. Charming, struggling, waiting for someone like me to come along and tell them what they already knew. Whispering Pines Books sat halfway down Main Street, wedged between a vintage clothing shop and a storefront that had been empty long enough for the windows to go cloudy with dust. The facade was worn in the way that suggested years of good intentions and not enough money. The paint on the wooden sign had faded to a soft green gray, and the lettering was the kind you'd find in a library built before the First World War. I parked across the street and let the engine idle for a moment while I took it in. The front window displayed a careful arrangement of new releases, but I could see from the angle of the glass that the display hadn't been changed in a while. A cat sat in the window, a gray tabby with the look of an animal that had long ago decided it owned the place. I killed the engine and reached for my briefcase. Inside, the folder waited, 32 pages of financials, property records, and comparables. Arthur had handed it to me on Friday with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. 4 hours, David, in and out. The numbers will tell you everything you need to know. I'd nodded, because that was what I always did. The numbers never lied. They never disappointed you. They never made you believe in something that wasn't there. The bell above the door chimed when I pushed it open. The sound was a single, clear note that hung in the air a beat longer than it needed to. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Old paper and wood polish and something faintly floral, like the ghost of a perfume that had been worn through the aisles years ago and never quite left. The second thing I noticed was the ceiling. Original tin, pressed in a pattern of vines and leaves, painted a cream that had yellowed at the edges but held its dignity. I'd appraised buildings with tin ceilings before. They were almost always the first thing to go when the budget got tight. The store stretched deeper than the street front suggested. Shelves ran floor to ceiling along both walls, and in the center of the room a series of low tables held displays arranged by someone who cared about what went where. Handwritten cards sat tucked between the books. Asterisk if you loved this one, try, in a looping, unhurried script. A stack of poetry collections sat on the nearest table, and curled on top of them, with the serene indifference of a creature that had never been told no, was the cat I'd seen in the window. "Can I help you?" The voice came from my left. I turned and saw her standing behind the counter, a mug of something steaming in one hand and a pricing gun in the other. She was in her 30s, I guessed, with the kind of face that had probably been called pretty once and had since earned something more interesting. Her eyes were blue, a shade that would have been soft if they hadn't been so watchful. She wore a sweater the color of oatmeal, and her hands were smudged with ink, the way a person's hands got when they'd been unpacking new stock all morning and hadn't thought to wash up. "I'm David Hayes," I said, "from Hale and Finch. I believe you're expecting me." Her expression didn't change, but something in the air between us shifted. It was a small thing, the way her fingers tightened on the pricing gun, the pause before she set the mug down. "The bank man," she said. "The appraiser. Same thing, isn't it?" I could have corrected her. I could have explained that my firm was a third-party assessor, that we didn't hold the note, that my job was simply to evaluate the property and its financials and deliver a report that would either recommend restructuring or trigger the 30-day foreclosure clause. But I'd learned a long time ago that when people called you the bank man, they weren't looking for a distinction, they were looking for a place to put their anger. "I'm here for the 4-hour assessment," I said. "I'd like to start with a walkthrough of the space, if that works for you." She looked at me for a long moment, then she set the pricing gun down on the counter and wiped her hands on a rag that had been tucked beside the register. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not giving you the tour. You want to see the store, you walk it yourself. I've got boxes to unpack." I nodded. That was fine. I worked better alone anyway. I started at the front and worked my way back. The floors were wide plank pine, worn smooth in the center of the aisles where decades of feet had passed. The shelves were solid oak, and they'd been built into the walls at some point in the store's history, not bolted on as an afterthought. I ran my hand along one of them as I passed. The wood was cool and dry. The lighting was a mix of track lights and old brass fixtures, and it cast a warmth that made the spines of the books glow in shades of amber and gold. I counted the sections as I walked: fiction, history, biography, a children's corner in the back with a rug that looked like it had been braided by hand, and a small chair that was probably too low for any adult to sit in comfortably. I pulled out my phone and started taking notes: square footage, condition of the fixtures, estimated replacement value. The numbers were what they were. The store was undercapitalized. The inventory was well curated but not, by any commercial standard, profitable. The foot traffic on a Tuesday morning in November was, as far as I could tell, exactly one person, me. And yet, I stopped in front of a shelf in the fiction section and pulled down a book at random, a copy of *The Member of the Wedding*, the spine cracked in 3 places, the pages soft from being turned. Tucked inside the front cover was a card in the same looping script I'd seen on the displays. *, a novel about the ache of belonging. Read it when you need to remember that loneliness is a season, not a life sentence. I put the book back. I told myself it was because the inventory wasn't my concern, but that wasn't true. I put it back because the card had made me feel something I didn't have a name for, and I didn't like that. The cat had followed me. I noticed it when I reached the history section. It sat at the end of the aisle, watching me with the kind of patience that suggested it had seen a dozen men in suits walk through this store and had outlasted every one of them. "Auden," Sarah said from behind the counter. She hadn't looked up from her boxes, but she'd clearly been tracking me. "His name is Auden. He's been here longer than I have." I didn't ask which Auden. I didn't need to. The store had already told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person who named a cat after a poet. I finished the walkthrough in 40 minutes. The rest of the assessment was supposed to be paperwork. I set up at one of the tables in the center of the store, spread my files out, and began working through the financials. The numbers were, as I'd expected, not good. The store had been running at a loss for 3 years. The mortgage was, by the terms of the original loan, due for a balloon payment in 18 months. The revenue from the summer tourist season had been declining steadily. There was no way to make the math work. There never was in cases like this. But I kept looking up from the spreadsheets. I kept noticing things: the way the light fell through the front window and pooled on the poetry table, the way the handwritten cards were tucked into every section, not just the displays, the way Sarah moved through the store while she worked, her hands quick and sure, her shoulders set in a line that suggested she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped expecting anyone to help. At noon, a woman came in with a toddler. She asked for a book about trains, and Sarah led her to the children's section without hesitation, pulling out 3 titles and handing them over with the kind of ease that came from knowing her stock by heart. The woman bought 2 of them. The transaction took less than 5 minutes, but I watched it happen, and I realized I'd stopped typing. "How long have you owned the store?" I asked when the woman had left. Sarah looked up from her boxes. Her expression was still guarded, but something in it had shifted, not softer, just less braced for a fight. "I don't own it," she said. "My father did. I'm just keeping it going. He passed 2 years ago, March," she said it plainly, the way people did when they'd had enough time to learn how to carry the weight but not enough time to put it down. "I'm sorry," I said. She didn't answer. She went back to her boxes, and I went back to my spreadsheets, and for a while neither of us spoke. But the question had opened something. A little while later, she came over to my table with a fresh mug of coffee and set it down beside my elbow without asking if I wanted it. "My father opened this store in 1982, she said. "He was a high school English teacher. He cashed out his pension to make the down payment. Everyone told him it was a mistake. A teacher doesn't know how to run a business. A bookstore in a town this size can't survive. He did it anyway." I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the store, at the shelves and the tin ceiling and the cat who had settled back onto the poetry table. He used to say that a bookstore wasn't a business, she said. It was a living room for people who didn't have one. He said that if you did it right, if you really listened to what people needed, the money would take care of itself. Did it? She turned her head then, and her eyes met mine. They were still watchful, but there was something else in them now. Something that had been there a long time and had learned to keep its own company. For a while, she said, and then it didn't. But that's not the point, is it? I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. The spreadsheets on the table in front of me said that the point was exactly that. The point was the numbers. The point was the bottom line. The point was that a store that couldn't pay its mortgage was a store that didn't get to keep its doors open, no matter how many living rooms it had provided. But I didn't say any of that. I sat there and I drank the coffee she'd brought me, and I asked another question, and then another, and then another. The 4-hour appointment stretched to 5. I asked about the Thursday poetry nights. I asked about the summer tourist season and whether the riverfront festivals brought in foot traffic. I asked about her father, about the years he'd spent behind the counter, about the way the town had changed and the way it hadn't. She answered, at first with the same guarded economy she'd used when I walked in, and then with something else. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of willingness, as if she'd decided that, for the next hour at least, I wasn't the enemy. At some point, I stopped taking notes. I didn't notice it happening. I just looked down and realized my phone was on the table and my hands were in my lap and I was listening. When I finally stood to leave, the light outside had shifted. The gray morning had given way to a thin, pale afternoon, and the river was visible through the gaps in the buildings, a ribbon of silver moving south toward the city I'd come from. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a business card. I set it on the counter, next to the pricing gun. If you have any questions, I said, about the process, about what comes next. She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. What does come next? I could have told her. I could have said that my report would go to Arthur Finch, that Arthur would review the numbers, that the numbers would almost certainly trigger the foreclosure clause, that she had 30 days, maybe less, but I didn't say it. I told myself it was because the assessment wasn't complete yet, because I still had to run the comparables, because there were due diligence steps that had to be followed. That wasn't true either. I'll be in touch, I said. She nodded. Her hand moved, and for a moment I thought she was going to take the card, but she didn't. She just rested her fingers on the edge of the counter, and her eyes, still watchful, still blue, held mine for a beat longer than the conversation required. I walked out into the November afternoon. The bell chimed behind me. The door closed. Through the window, I could see Auden still curled on the poetry table, and Sarah standing behind the counter, and the tin ceiling, and the handwritten cards, and all of it, the whole impossible, unprofitable, necessary place, waiting. I got into my car. I sat with my hands on the wheel. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, and I thought about the card on the counter, and the coffee I hadn't asked for, and the way she'd said, "That's not the point, is it?" asterisk. And I realized with a slow, unwelcome clarity that the 4-hour assessment I'd driven up here to complete was not going to be the last time I walked through that door. The cold had teeth by the time I pulled into Cold Spring again. 2 days. That was how long I'd lasted before the folder on my desk stopped making sense, before the numbers I'd been trained to trust started looking like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I told myself it was due diligence. A second walkthrough, standard practice when the first pass left questions. But I'd been sitting in my car on East 72nd for 20 minutes that morning, coffee gone cold in the cup holder, and I'd known, with the kind of certainty I usually reserved for square footage and depreciation schedules, that I was lying. The bookstore's windows glowed amber against the November dark. Main Street had emptied out. The antique shop next door was shuttered. The cafe across the street had turned its sign to closed. But Whispering Pines Books was alive, and I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in my coat pockets, watching the silhouettes move behind the glass like I was reading a story I hadn't been invited into. I pushed the door open. The bell chimed, the same sound from Tuesday. The same warm air, thick with paper and wood polish, and the faint, sweet undertone of someone's perfume. But the store had transformed. Chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle near the poetry table. Someone had strung fairy lights along the front counter, tiny white points that caught the tin ceiling and threw it back in constellations, and there were people, a dozen of them, maybe more, shrugging off coats and greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a congregation. Sarah was behind the counter, stacking paper cups beside a carafe of something that steamed. She looked up when the bell rang, and her expression flickered through recognition, surprise, and something else I couldn't name before settling into a careful neutrality. "You came back," she said. Not an accusation, not a welcome, just a fact, delivered flat, like she was reading it off a receipt and hadn't decided yet what it meant. "I told you I might. You said you'd be in touch. That's different." She had me there. I'd left my card on the counter 2 days ago like a coward leaving a calling card at a duel, and I'd given her no reason to expect my face. I unbuttoned my coat, buying time. I wanted to see the place in operation. The numbers don't capture foot traffic patterns or community engagement or... I trailed off. Even to my own ears, it sounded like what it was, a justification I'd rehearsed in the rearview mirror. Or what? She tilted her head. A strand of hair had escaped her bun and lay against her cheek. She didn't tuck it back. Or anything that matters. The words landed heavier than I'd meant them to. Sarah's hand stilled on the stack of cups. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then a woman with a cloud of gray curls and a scarf the color of autumn leaves swept between us like a force of nature, and the moment broke. "Sarah, darling, the cheese plate is a triumph, and I'm telling everyone you made it yourself, even if you didn't." The woman set a canvas tote bag on the counter and beamed. "And who's this? New blood for poetry night? This is David Hayes," Sarah said. "He's with the bank." The warmth in the woman's face dimmed by a carefully calibrated degree. "Ah, the appraiser." I extended my hand. "David is fine. Maggie Lerner." She took my hand with a grip that suggested she'd made up her mind about me but was willing to be proven wrong. "I've been coming to this store since before Sarah was tall enough to reach the counter. Her father used to let me pay in installments when the pottery wasn't selling. You don't find that kind of grace in a chain store." She said it like a challenge. Like she was drawing a line in the sand and waiting to see which side I'd stand on. I let go of her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a defense of something I was no longer sure I believed in. Maggie turned back to Sarah. "You look exhausted, sweetheart. Have you eaten?" "I'm fine." "You always say that. It's the Whitlock family motto." Maggie patted her arm and moved off toward the chairs, and I watched Sarah's face in the aftermath. The smile she'd worn for Maggie stayed in place a beat too long, then slipped, and what was underneath was the same thing I'd seen on Tuesday when she'd talked about her father, a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that came from carrying something alone for years because there was no one left to hand it to. I took a chair near the back, not hiding exactly, just not presuming. The poetry night was not mine. I was a guest who hadn't been invited, and I'd learned enough about Cold Spring in 2 visits to know that newcomers were observed closely. I kept my coat folded over my lap and my notebook in my pocket and waited to see what I'd walked into. The first reader was a man in his 60s with a voice like gravel in a stream. He recited a poem about his wife's garden, about the way she'd planted peonies the year they married and how they still came up every spring, 30 years later, even though she was gone. The second was a young woman with a lip ring who delivered something sharp and furious about student debt. The third was Maggie, who recited a poem about the river in winter, and her voice caught on the last line, and no one looked away. I sat there with my hands on my knees and let it wash over me. These were not performances, they were confessions. The room was not a room. It was a living thing, breathing in unison, and the walls that held it were the same walls I'd measured on Tuesday, the same square footage I'd entered into my spreadsheet under asterisk retail space, condition fair asterisk, but the spreadsheet had no column for this. For the way a room full of strangers could become a room full of people who knew each other's griefs by heart. A weight settled against my ankle. I looked down. Auden had materialized at my feet, a warm, solid presence in the dim light. The cat blinked up at me with the serene indifference I remembered from Tuesday, then curled into a tight circle against my shoe. I didn't move. I was afraid if I did, he'd leave, and I found, to my surprise, that I didn't want him to. Sarah was standing by the counter, and she was watching me. Our eyes met across the crowded room. She didn't smile. I didn't either, but something passed between us, a recognition that we were both, in our separate ways, in over our heads. She looked away first, and it cost her something. I could see it in the way her shoulders straightened before she turned back to the carafe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again. I pulled it out and saw the name on the screen, and the warmth in my chest went cold. Arthur Finch. I stepped outside. The November air hit my face like a slap. I answered on the third ring. Hayes, David. Arthur's voice was as calm and as sharp as a blade laid flat. I expected your preliminary report on my desk this morning. Imagine my surprise when I found my inbox empty. I need more time. A pause. Arthur didn't do pauses by accident. He placed them like punctuation, letting the silence do the work of a reprimand. The assessment was scheduled for 4 hours. You've now had 5 days. The property is more complex than the numbers suggested. The property is a bookstore in a town of 2,000 people. It's not a mixed-use development in Brooklyn. I'm not asking for a dissertation, David. I'm asking for a recommendation. I looked back through the window, the fairy lights, the semicircle of chairs. Sarah, pouring coffee for a woman in a green coat, her hands steady, her face soft in the glow. I understand the timeline. Do you? Because Marcus Hale is asking questions I don't have answers for. The 30-day window is not a suggestion, it's a contractual obligation. If the numbers don't support the asset, we recommend foreclosure. That's the job. I know the job. Then do it. The line went dead. I stood on the empty sidewalk with the phone in my hand and the cold working its way through my coat. Inside, someone "Hey." A man's voice, warm and rolling, then applause, and the sound of chairs shifting, and the low murmur of people who were not ready to go home yet, who were lingering in the warmth because the warmth was worth lingering in. I could leave. I could get in my car and drive back to Manhattan and write the report Arthur wanted, and by morning the whole thing would be over. A recommendation, a signature, a bookstore that became a line item in a foreclosure filing. It was the job. It was what I'd been sent to do, but I didn't leave. I stood there with my breath fogging in the cold and Auden's warmth still ghosting against my ankle, and I let the phone go dark in my hand. The numbers were clear. The numbers had been clear since Tuesday, but the numbers had never heard a man recite a poem about peonies. The numbers had never watched Sarah Whitlock's hands steady on a coffee cup while her eyes gave away everything she wouldn't say aloud. I opened the door and went back inside. The river path stretched ahead of us, a ribbon of packed dirt and fallen leaves running parallel to water the color of dull slate. I'd walked it alone twice since the poetry night, both times telling myself I was clearing my head, both times knowing that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I'd hoped to run into her. And now I had. Sarah walked a half step ahead of me, her hands buried in the pockets of a worn wool coat, her pace unhurried. The cold had settled into something softer than the previous week's bite, the kind of November chill that didn't attack so much as it leaned in close and stayed, damp leaves and wood smoke and the mineral smell of the river itself. I'd been in Cold Spring 5 days, and the place had already stopped feeling like an assignment. You came back, she said, not quite looking at me. I did. Most of them don't. I didn't ask who she meant by them, the bankmen, the assessors. The suits who drove up from the city, walked through a business with a clipboard, and drove back to Manhattan without ever really having been there. I was one of them, and she didn't know it yet, and the knowledge sat in my chest like stone I'd swallowed by mistake. The poetry night was something, I said. I wasn't expecting that. She glanced at me then, and something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. What were you expecting? Honestly, a handful of people reading from their phones and a lot of empty chairs. You underestimate this town. I'm starting to realize that. The path curved toward the water, and we followed it without discussion. A bench sat near the bank, old wood weathered silver, and Sarah stopped beside it but didn't sit. The river moved past us with a quiet persistence, the surface broken here and there by a submerged branch. Across the water, the hills had gone mostly bare, the last color leaching out of them as dusk came on. My father used to walk this path every evening, she said, after he closed up. Didn't matter if it was raining or snowing or 10 below. He said it was the only place he could hear himself think after a day of listening to other people's stories. I watched her face as she spoke, the way her voice changed around the word father asterisk. Not the careful, measured tone she used when talking about inventory or events or the store's finances. Something rawer underneath, like a floorboard that gave when you stepped on it wrong. He opened the store in 1982, I said, and the words were out before I could stop them. Sarah turned to face me fully. How do you know that? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I could feel the moment splitting open in front of me, two paths diverging the way the river paths split around a fallen oak up ahead. I could deflect. I could keep the professional distance I'd worn like a second skin for years, or I could tell her the truth and watch whatever this was between us collapse before it had a chance to become anything at all. Because I'm not just someone who wandered into your bookstore on a Tuesday afternoon, I said. Her eyes didn't leave my face. The river kept moving behind her. The light kept fading, the sky going from gray to something closer to violet. I'm the appraiser, the one Hale and Finch sent to assess the property. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that stretched or hung or any of the words people use to dress up a pause. It was just quiet. The specific, particular quiet of a woman who'd just learned that the man standing beside her on a river path had been sent to take apart everything she'd built. I see, she said. 2 syllables, and they carried more weight than anything she'd said to me before. Sarah, how long have you been here? 5 days. I came up Tuesday morning. The initial assessment was supposed to take 4 hours, but you stayed. I stayed. She turned back toward the water. Her hands were still in her pockets, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if bracing for something. I wanted to reach for her. I didn't. I'd earned the distance between us, and I had no right to close it. I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not here because I want to be. I mean, I am now, but that's not how it started. Arthur Finch handed me a folder with 32 pages of financials and told me to drive up and do my job. That's what I do. I look at numbers, I make recommendations, I don't get involved. And yet here you are, on a river path, at dusk, getting involved. There was no warmth in her voice, but there wasn't quite ice either. She was holding herself at a remove, and I recognized the posture because I'd spent years in the same one. Something happened, I said, a few years ago. An assessment I handled in the city, a property I believed in, a business I thought was worth saving. I went against the numbers. I trusted my instincts. I wrote a report that recommended restructuring instead of foreclosure, and I staked my reputation on it. What happened? The owner took the restructuring terms and ran, sold off the assets, pocketed the capital, and disappeared. Left his employees with nothing and the bank holding a shell. My instincts were wrong. My judgment was wrong. And Arthur Finch made it very clear that if I ever made that mistake again, I wouldn't have a career to come back to. Sarah didn't speak. The river moved past us, and somewhere up the path a bird called out once and then went quiet. So I stopped trusting my instincts, I said. I became the guy who looks at the numbers and nothing else, because the numbers don't lie. The numbers don't betray you. The numbers don't make you believe in something that turns out to be a lie. And then you walked into my bookstore, and then I walked into your bookstore. She turned to face me again, and this time there was something different in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the hard edge had softened, and I could see her working through what I'd told her, turning it over the way she might turn over a page in a book she wasn't sure she wanted to keep reading. The poetry night, she said. You were there. I was there. You stayed after. When everyone else left. I couldn't leave. I don't know how to explain it. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after the first day, and I couldn't make myself drive back to the city. And then I came back for the poetry night, and I watched your community fill that room, and I watched you, and I realized that the numbers don't know anything about what that place actually is. Her eyes held mine. The violet light had deepened, and the first cold of true evening was settling into the air. I could see my breath when I exhaled, and I could see hers. My father's last words to me, she said, were about the store. He was in the hospital, and he couldn't talk much by then, but he grabbed my hand and he said, "Don't let them turn it into something else. It's not just a building, it's not just books, it's a place where people come to be less alone." And then he made me promise. He made me promise I'd keep it alive. She stopped. Her voice had gone rough at the edges, but she didn't look away from the river. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence hold what she'd just given me, because I understood, in a way I hadn't understood anything in years, that she was handing me something she didn't hand to anyone. He died 2 years ago in March, she said, and I've been trying to keep that promise ever since. I left a job in publishing. I left a life in the city. I came back here and I took over a store that was already struggling, and I've been fighting every day since to keep it from becoming just another empty storefront on Main Street. That's why you were so guarded when I first came in. That's why I was so guarded, because I knew what you were the moment you walked through the door. I've been waiting for someone like you to show up for 2 years. The words landed, and I let them. I'd earned them. I'd walked into her store with a folder full of numbers and a professional smile and the quiet, unspoken intention of closing her down, and she'd seen me for exactly what I was. The only surprise was that she was still standing here beside me, still talking, still letting the conversation continue past the point where she could have walked away. "I haven't filed the report," I said. "What?" "The assessment, the recommendation, it's due. Arthur Finch has called me twice. Marcus Hale is waiting on it. The 30-day clock is running, and I haven't filed anything." She stared at me. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what to write. Because the numbers say one thing, and everything I've seen in the last 5 days says something else. Because your father was right. It's not just a building. It's not just books, and I don't know how to put that in a report that Arthur Finch will accept." The river kept moving. The light kept fading, and Sarah Whitlock stood beside me on the path, and she didn't walk away, and she didn't tell me to leave, and the space between us felt less like a distance and more like something that might, with time and care and a great deal of luck, become a bridge. "I should go," I said finally. "It's getting dark." "Yes," she said, "it is." But neither of us moved. The water ran silver in the last light, and the hills across the river had gone dark, and the path stretched back toward town the way it had come, and I stood there with the weight of an unfiled report and the memory of a dead man's promise and the quiet, impossible knowledge that I couldn't walk away from this place or this woman, no matter what it cost me. The phone rang at 11:15, a sound so sharp against the quiet of the inn that I felt it in my teeth before I heard it. I had been sitting on the edge of the bed for the better part of an hour, my suitcase open on the luggage rack near the window, my laptop and the manila folder with the assessment forms on the nightstand where I had left them 3 nights ago and hadn't touched since. The room at the Maple Inn was small and clean and smelled faintly of cedar, and the radiator ticked in its own rhythm, and outside the window the November dark had settled over Cold Spring like something that meant to stay. I knew the number before I looked at the screen. I let it ring twice more, watching the name pulse there, and then I picked up. "Finch, David." His voice was flat, the way it always was when he had already decided what the conversation would be. "I'm going to assume you have a very good reason for making me call you at this hour." I didn't answer. The radiator clicked twice. Through the window I could see the faint orange glow of the street lamps on Main Street, and beyond them the dark mass of the river, and beyond that nothing at all. "Marcus Hale wants the report on his desk by 9 tomorrow morning," Finch said. "He wanted it on his desk 3 days ago. I've been covering for you, and I'm out of cover." "I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you've spent the better part of a week in a town 90 minutes from your desk and you still haven't filed a single page." "The assessment was 4 hours, David. 4. What exactly have you been doing?" I looked at the folder on the nightstand. The forms were still blank. I had filled in the property address and the owner's name and the date of inspection, and then I had stopped, and every night since I had told myself I would finish them in the morning, and every morning I had walked down to Main Street instead and stood outside the bookstore with my hands in my pockets and watched the light come on in the front window. "I've been thorough," I said. "Don't." The word came fast and hard. "Don't play games with me. I know what thorough looks like, and this isn't it. You're stalling. I want to know why." I could have told him. I could have said that the bookstore had an original tin ceiling from 1982 and a cat named Auden who slept in the poetry section and a woman with ink on her hands who had given up a career in Manhattan to keep her father's promise alive. I could have said that the numbers on the page didn't account for the way the whole town showed up on a Thursday night to recite poems aloud, or the way Maggie Lerner had been coming there since before Sarah was tall enough to reach the counter, or the way the river looked in the last light when you stood on the path and knew you were in a place that mattered. I could have said all of that and Finch would have heard none of it. "The numbers are complicated," I said instead. "The numbers are never complicated. That's the point of view. You're the one who doesn't get complicated." A pause, and I heard him shift in his chair, the creak of leather and the distant hum of the Manhattan office that never really went quiet. "I know about the bookstore, David. I know about the owner. Sarah Whitlock, isn't it?" Her father died 2 years ago, left her the business. It's a sad story, and I'm sure she's very compelling, but we are not in the business of sad stories. We are in the business of assessing risk, and that property is a risk, and you know it. I didn't say anything. My hand was tight around the phone, and I could feel the heat of it against my ear, and outside the window the street lamp flickered once and then steadied. "You've been there 5 days," Finch said. "That's 3 days longer than the assessment required. Hale is asking questions. If I don't have that report on his desk by morning, he's going to start asking them about you, and about me, and about whether I made a mistake when I pulled you off the bench and put you in the field. Is that what you want? No. Then file the report." The radiator clicked again. I looked at the suitcase, at the folded shirts and the tie I hadn't worn since Tuesday, and the small leather case that held my watch and my cufflinks, and I thought about the drive back to Manhattan in the morning dark, the tunnel of headlights on the Tecumseh, the office waiting with its gray carpet and its fluorescent light and its coffee that tasted like the machine had given up. I thought about walking into Hale's office and laying the folder on his desk and watching him sign the page that would put a 30-day clock on a woman who had already lost too much. I thought about Sarah's face on the river path, the way she had looked at me when I told her who I was, the silence that had followed, and the way she had not walked away. "David, I'm not asking. This is the last call. You file the report by 9 tomorrow morning, or you clean out your desk. Those are the options. There isn't a third one." He waited. I could hear him breathing, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had delivered ultimatums before and knew how long to let them land. "I'll have it to you," I said. By 9. By 9. The line went dead. I set the phone on the nightstand and sat there in the quiet, and the radiator kept ticking, and the street lamp kept burning, and the town outside the window kept being the town I had come to for 4 hours and had not yet left after 5 days. I stood up and walked to the window and looked out at Main Street, at the dark storefronts and the empty sidewalks and the one light still burning in the window of Whispering Pines Books, and I knew, standing there, that I had just lied to the man who held my career in his hands. I wasn't going to file the report. I had known it since the river path, since Sarah had told me about her father's last words and I had told her about my own failure, and we had stood there in the silver light with the water running past and neither of us had moved. I had known it, and I had not admitted it, not even to myself, not until Finch's voice had forced the choice into the open. The report was not coming, the numbers were not going to save me. I was going to walk into that office tomorrow morning and tell Arthur Finch and Marcus Hale that I had spent 5 days in a town that had taught me something I had forgotten how to learn, and I was going to tell them that the bookstore was not a risk to be managed but a place that deserved to survive, and I was going to lose my job for saying it, and I was going to say it anyway. I turned from the window and walked back to the bed and opened the suitcase wider. I took out the shirt I had packed for the morning and hung it in the closet. I took out the tie and laid it on the dresser. I took out the small leather case and set it beside the lamp. I was unpacking, I was staying. I didn't know for how long, or what I would say to Sarah when I saw her, or whether she would even want to hear it, but I knew that I could not drive back to Manhattan in the morning dark with the report still in my hands and the river still running behind me and the light still burning in the window of a bookstore that had been opened in 1982 by a man who had believed in something. I sat down on the bed again. The radiator ticked, the street lamp held its ground, and somewhere across town, in the back room of Whispering Pines Books, Sarah Whitlock was holding a letter I did not yet know existed, a formal notice on bank letterhead that gave her 10 days to save everything her father had built, and she was reading it alone, and she was wondering if I had known about it, and she was deciding whether to trust me, and neither of us slept that night, and neither of us knew what the morning would bring, but the morning was coming anyway, and for the first time in 5 days I was not afraid to meet it. I pushed open the door of Whispering Pines Books at a little past 2 in the afternoon, and the bell above the frame sounded the same note it had sounded every time I'd entered that week, a small brass announcement that meant nothing to the door and everything to whoever stood behind the counter. The store smelled of paper and dust and the faint cinnamon of someone's tea cooling on a shelf, and the original tin ceiling caught the light exactly the way I remembered, its pressed metal panels holding the afternoon in a soft, even glow. Sarah was at the register, pricing a stack of used paperbacks with a handheld stamper. She looked up when the bell rang, and I saw the 4 days in her face before she spoke. The skin beneath her eyes was shadowed in a way that makeup couldn't have hidden, and she hadn't tried to, and her sweater was the same gray one she'd worn the night on the river path, the sleeves pushed up past her wrists, a small ink smudge on the heel of her right hand. She looked like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had only just set it down. "You're back," she said. The stamper hovered above a paperback and didn't come down. "I'm back." She set the stamper on the counter and straightened the stack of books with both hands, a gesture that took longer than it needed to. "I wasn't sure you would be." "I wasn't sure either," I said, "for about 4 days." That pulled something from her, a small exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. 4 days, that's specific. I've been counting. I had been. I had spent the 4 days since the ultimatum in a rented room at the Maple Inn, and I had walked the river path twice more, and I had eaten breakfast at the diner on Main Street where the waitress had started remembering my coffee order, and I had not filed the report. I had not called Arthur Finch back. I had not packed my suitcase. I had done none of the things my job required me to do, and I had done all of the things a man does when he is trying to learn whether a place will have him. Sarah watched me from behind the counter, and I could see her deciding something. The way her fingers rested on the edge of the register, not gripping it, not letting it go. The way her eyes moved over my face, looking for the thing she'd seen on the river path and finding it still there. "I have something to tell you," I said. "I have something to tell you too." I nodded. "Yours first." She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a sheet of paper, crisp and white and folded in thirds. She handed it to me across the register, and I didn't need to unfold it to know what it was. The bank letterhead was visible through the paper, the weight of it familiar in my hand, the kind of paper my firm used for exactly one purpose. I unfolded it anyway. I scanned the first line. I took in the 10 days. I looked at the date at the top and saw that it had been issued the morning after my last call with Finch, which meant he had sent it before I'd even had time to refuse him, which meant he had never believed I would do what he asked. "I got this 4 days ago," Sarah said. "I've been trying to figure out if you knew." I didn't know. I handed the letter back to her. "But I'm not surprised he sent it." "You're not surprised." Her voice was even, but the stamper was still on the counter and she hadn't picked it up. "So you know who sent it." "Arthur Finch." "My managing director." I watched her absorb the name. I watched her file it beside the other names she had for me, the ones she'd used that first afternoon when I walked in wearing a suit and carrying a clipboard, and she'd looked at me like I was the weather coming in, the bank man, the suit, a corporate threat. I had been all of those things, and I had also been none of them, and now I had to tell her which was which. "I was the appraiser," I said. "I was sent here 4 weeks ago to do a 4-hour assessment. The numbers were bad, the balloon payments coming due in 18 months. By every metric my firm uses, this store should have been recommended for foreclosure within 30 days. I paused. "I didn't file the report." Sarah's hand stopped on the edge of the counter. Her fingers curled around the wood, and I saw the knuckle go pale before she loosened it again. "You didn't file it?" "No." "Why not?" I could have told her about the river path. I could have told her about the poetry night, about the way Maggie Lerner had recited a poem about her dead husband and the whole room had gone quiet in a way that wasn't silence but presence. I could have told her about the tin ceiling and the way the light fell through it at 4 o'clock, about the smell of old paper and the sound of Auden purring in the biography section, about the fact that I had walked into this store expecting to count square footage and had walked out counting something else entirely. I could have told her all of that, and I would, eventually, but right now she was holding a foreclosure notice, and she had been holding it alone for 4 days, and she deserved the simplest, truest answer I had. "Because I couldn't," I said. "Because I walked in here and I saw what your father built, and I saw what you've given up to keep it, and I couldn't be the person who took that away from you." She didn't speak. The bell above the door chimed behind me, and I heard footsteps on the worn floorboards, and I didn't turn around because I couldn't look away from Sarah's face, from the way her mouth had opened slightly and her eyes had gone bright in a way that wasn't tears yet but was close. "Well," said a voice behind me, and I knew it before I turned. "That's about the most honest thing I've heard a man in a suit say in 40 years. Maggie Lerner was standing in the doorway with her scarf trailing over one shoulder and her gray curls damp from the afternoon mist. Behind her, two other regulars I recognized from the poetry night, a woman with a canvas tote bag and a man in a waxed jacket who had recited a poem about his grandfather's orchard. They had come in for their afternoon coffee and their afternoon books, and they had walked into something else entirely, and none of them was leaving. "I mean it," I said, and I turned back to Sarah. "I'm not going back to Manhattan. I'm not filing the report. I'm staying." "You're staying," Sarah repeated. The word came out of her like she was testing its weight. "I'm staying. I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't have a plan. But I have a week, and I have a set of numbers, and I have a very good understanding of how my firm thinks about risk, which means I also have a very good understanding of how to make them think differently." Maggie stepped forward and set her bag on the nearest table. "You're talking about a restructured loan. I'm talking about a restructured loan. You can do that. I can write it. I can present it. I can make the case that this store is a community asset with a revenue trajectory that doesn't fit their standard model but is still viable if they adjust the terms." I looked at Sarah. "I can't promise they'll accept it, but I can promise I'll try." Sarah's hand came up to her collar, a small, unconscious gesture, her fingers finding the edge of the sweater and holding there. "You would do that for a store you walked into 2 weeks ago. I would do that for you." The words landed in the quiet of the bookstore, and no one spoke, and the radiator in the corner made its small ticking sound, and Auden emerged from somewhere behind the poetry section and wound his way through the legs of the table and came to a stop at my feet, his gray head tilting up at me with the slow, considering gaze of a cat who had been watching this whole thing unfold and had finally decided to weigh in. He rubbed his flank against my ankle. I felt the vibration of his purr through the leather of my shoe. "Well," Maggie said, "that cat doesn't like anyone." The woman with the canvas tote bag laughed, a short, surprised sound. The man in the waxed jacket nodded slowly, his hands in his pockets. And Sarah looked down at Auden, and then up at me, and then at the letter still folded on the counter between us, and I saw her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the way they might if she had been holding something heavy and someone had finally reached over and taken half of it. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Accept help. I've been doing it alone for 2 years." "You don't have to know how," Maggie said. "You just have to let us." The regulars moved then, the way people in a small town move when something has been decided and they are simply stepping into the shape of it. The woman with the tote bag asked about the loan terms and whether they needed a petition. The man in the waxed jacket said he knew 3 other shopkeepers on Main Street who would write letters of support. Maggie pulled a notebook from her bag and began writing down names, her handwriting large and looping, the kind of handwriting that took up space on a page and didn't apologize for it. And Sarah stood behind the counter and watched them, and I watched her, and I saw something move across her face that I had not seen there before. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was the beginning of the thing that comes before hope, the moment when a person who has been carrying something alone looks around and realizes there are other hands in the room. I reached across the counter and picked up the foreclosure notice. I folded it in thirds, the way it had been folded when she handed it to me. I set it on the register beside the stack of paperbacks. "This doesn't mean anything anymore," I said. "Not the way it did." Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at my hand still resting on the counter beside it. She looked at the regulars, who were now discussing the logistics of a community pledge drive with the kind of energy people bring to a problem they have decided is already solved. And then she looked at me, and her eyes were the same blue they had been on the river path, the same blue they had been the first afternoon I walked in, the same blue they had been every moment in between, but something in them had shifted, and I knew what it was because I felt it in my own chest, a loosening, a letting go, a door that had been closed for a long time swinging open on its hinges. "You really didn't file it," she said. "I really didn't, and you really aren't leaving. I really aren't." She reached out and picked up the stamper. She turned it over in her hands, the small black handle, the wheel of numbers, the ink pad that needed replacing. She set it down again. She looked at the stack of paperbacks, at the tin ceiling, at the window where the afternoon light was beginning its slow shift toward evening. And then she looked at me, and what she said next, I'm not going to repeat. Some things belong to 2 people and a cat named Auden and the slow afternoon light coming through a Hudson Valley storefront. Some things don't need an audience, but I will tell you this. I drove 90 minutes for a 4-hour appointment, and the appointment never ended. I came to Cold Spring with a folder of numbers and a job to do, and the numbers had been right about the bookstore the same way numbers are always right and never enough. What did go away, what could not survive 5 days in a town where a man recites a poem about peonies and a cat decides whom to forgive, was the part of me that had decided the numbers were the only thing worth trusting. The numbers had never watched Sarah Whitlock's hands steady on a coffee cup while her eyes gave away everything she wouldn't say aloud. The numbers had never seen the way her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch in the moment she realized she did not have to carry it alone. I think now, sitting here, about how much of my life I had spent making sure no one would ever ask me to stay. That was a story from Isabel Cross. If you want to keep listening, this channel posts new stories every week, slow burns and second chances and the small moments that change everything. Subscribe if any of it found you, and tell me in the comments what you took with you. Until next time, love, Isabel.